Hey guys, I'm Mnar Muhawesh and welcome to another episode of MintPress News' Behind the Headline, hosted in partnership with Free Speech TV. Today I'll be exploring the mineral-rich Congo's struggle to shrug off the chains of colonialism, and documentary filmmaker Robbie Martin joins me to expose the post-9/11 Neocon takeover of Washington. And finally, journalist Rania Khalek is here to discuss the media's double standard when it comes to Israel and ISIS. And of course, this episode wouldn't be possible without this month's featured sponsor, Mystic Man Beard Oil, organic and sustainable personal care inspired by the power and positive influence of the great mystics of history. You can learn more about our sponsors at mintpressnews.com. Now let's get behind the headline. Your everyday gadgets' rechargeable batteries are most likely made possible by the Congolese child labor industry, who are exploited every single day for mineral extraction to feed the Western tech boom. A recent Amnesty International report sounded the alarm on a blood mineral mined by Congolese children as young as 7 years old and used in rechargeable lithium-ion batteries found in most of our laptops, smartphones, and even electric cars. The mineral is known as cobalt, and more than half of the world's supply comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo, including at least 20%, which is mined by so-called artisanal miners in the southern part of the country. Now, the report titled "This is What We Die For" explains the conditions they work in. These artisanal miners mine by hand using the most basic tools to dig out rocks from tunnels deep underground. Artisanal miners include children as young as 7 who scavenge for rocks containing cobalt in the discarded byproducts of industrial mines and who wash and sort the ore before it's sold. Now, most of the cobalt is then resold to corporations by Congo Dongfeng Mining International, a wholly owned subsidiary of China's Huawei Cobalt Company. Now, from there, Amnesty was able to trace the cobalt to products linked to some of the world's largest and best-known consumer electronic companies, including Apple, Dell, HP, Huawei, Lenovo, LG, Microsoft, Samsung, Sony, and Vodafone, as well as other car manufacturers like Daimler AG, Volkswagen, and Chinese firm BYD. Overall, there are between 110,000 to 150,000 artisanal miners in the Congo, including over 40,000 children as miners in the country. Most of them tasked with producing cobalt between 12 and 24 hours a day for just $1 to $2 wages, according to UNICEF. Now, 17 children interviewed by Amnesty who worked in 5 different mines described being beaten or seeing other children being beaten by security guards. They also said those guards who are hired by the mining companies demanded money from those children, and without recourse against exploitive practices, they are frequently taken advantage of by the traders. But Congo, one of the poorest countries in the world, has suffered more than a century with colonialism and exploitation by Western nations, driven by consumer and industry demands on other continents. Even before Europe scrambled for control in Africa, though, one royal had already set his sights on the difficult-to-reach area of Congo. In 1876, King Leopold II of Belgium organized a conference where participants discussed ways to stop the West African slave trade, get medical aid to Africa, and coordinate map-making efforts. But the conference, of course, and the supposedly benevolent committee he agreed to head were nothing more than smokescreens for the king's ambitions of building a railway that could carry goods out of the heart of Africa. And thus, he waged a humanitarian war. Sound familiar? With the king, not the Belgian government, as owner and ruler, people were forced to extract the country's immense wealth, including rubber, which was exported to fuel the industrial boom of the 19th and early 20th century Europe and America. Under the guise of bringing civilization to the Africans, Marty Jezer, writing for the Brattleboro Reformer, explained the brutal lengths Leopold took. This army forcibly conscripted African youth to fill its ranks, It then went from village to village, taking the women hostage and forcing the men to go deep in the jungle to tap the indigenous rubber trees. Those who resisted were mowed down by machine gun fire. Many were beheaded or had their hands cut off. With women held hostage and men working in forced labor to maximize the rubber harvest, no one was tending to crops, and starvation took hold, as well as disease creeping in. Between 1880 and 1920, the country lost about 10 million people, or at least half of the country's population. International outrage finally erupted in 1908, at which point the Belgian government took control from Leopold. But as Jezer noted, Belgium extracted rubber, ivory, diamonds, and uranium from the Congo and gave back nothing. No schools, no hospitals, no infrastructure, except that which facilitated the export of resources. Now, the uranium used to make the atom bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki even came from mines in the Congo. Congo threw off the shackles of colonialism in 1960, but the next several years saw a quick succession of leaders, and by 1971, a corrupt one-party government under Joseph Mobutu took over, renaming the country Zaire. Mobutu, a staunch anti-communist, won the support of several U.S. administrations. And since Mobutu was forced to flee in 1977, a civil war has raged and the country has been devastated by an AIDS epidemic. And this is where Congo finds itself today. Despite some reforms and democratic elections, it's in relatively the same place it was more than 100 years ago, under a corrupt, rubber-hungry king whose brutality knew no limits. Both now and then, the rush was for cobalt, rubber, diamonds, copper, basically whatever Congo has that the world wants, no matter the human cost. And Chinese, American, and European companies are exploiting child and adult laborers to feed the tech cravings of people around the world who find themselves in a position to indulge their hunger for gadgets. These Congolese child laborers will probably never own a smartphone with a rechargeable battery, but without their toil for meager wages and dangerous conditions, it's hard to say whether you or I could. How does an empire build support for its resource exploitation abroad? Well, immediately following the 9/11 attacks, Americans were riddled with panic and anxiety. And talking heads and even our elected leaders stoked our fears, warning there would be more attacks to come unless we stop the terrorists in their tracks. But who exactly flew the planes into the Twin Towers? Well, quickly, the Bush administration and other pro-war neocons in Washington tossed out some pretty interesting answers. Osama bin Laden, Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, or maybe even Muslims. With this, Bush launched the invasion of Afghanistan and announced the official war on terror, which continues today with no end in sight and no real victories to speak of. But then in 2003, the target shifted. Saddam Hussein, the leader of Iraq, who America had once cherished, even installed and armed, now had weapons of mass destruction. Our intelligence was definite, they said, and with that, the U.S. invaded Iraq. Those WMDs were never found, of course, because they never existed. And not only was the intel faulty, it turned out to be a red herring, obscuring a war for oil and resources. A country was invaded, its people killed, injured, and displaced, so the U.S. could install someone more friendly to our interests. Meanwhile, the upheaval in these and countries hit by the war on terror created a power vacuum that's being exploited today by Daesh or ISIS. None of what unfolded was unforeseeable. So who was on the sidelines in Washington cheerleading for this war? And despite being pounded daily by the mainstream media and our politicians that this war is against terrorism or ISIS, like any war, what appears on the surface as a humanitarian effort is usually a smokescreen for something else. Now, here to answer these and other questions is Robbie Martin, the filmmaker behind A Very Heavy Agenda. His documentary film series examines how neoconservatives seized on 9/11 as a catalyst for establishing a new world order. With 9/11 fading from our memory, Martin warns the U.S. created a new enemy, so it chose an old one. And no, it wasn't Muslims. It's Russia. Take a look.
What most people, would know as PNAC is the Project for the New American Century. The founders of that organization, Bill Kristol and Robert Kagan, I think have flown under most people's radars. Some people might have seen Bill Kristol over the years, like as a pundit on Fox News, and now he's a pundit on CNN and ABC. But I believe these people had more influence on the Bush administration and their neoconservative policies, but I think they also had an incredible amount of influence on sort of the DC media class as well, and that was also a really important component. There are others, that flew under the radar for the most part, like Richard Pearl. Paul Wolfowitz had an important position inside the White House, so he was probably the main, I would say, the main influential neocon who actually made it inside the White House. But now I feel like there's a little bit more of a public awareness of these people. Most recently, the co-founder of the Project for the New American Century endorsed Hillary Clinton out of fear of a Trump presidency. So he's actually in the news again. So as much as these people try to stay under the radar, they still play very important roles in sort of where the neoconservative agenda is headed in D.C.
Right, and I'm really glad you talked about that. Tell us more about a very heavy agenda and what each part exposes and why you focus so much on neoconservatives.
So a very heavy agenda is broken into three parts. And part one is pretty much all about what the neoconservatives did during the Bush administration. And I start out part one showing how they were the primary force in trying to draw a connection between Saddam Hussein and 9/11. And when that fell apart, they tried to connect Saddam Hussein and the 2001 anthrax letter attacks, which of course there was never any evidence of. But they were able to plant the seeds of that and hint at it enough where I believe that it helped push sort of that panic and hysteria over the edge so that Americans would let their guard down about going into another war. Part two of the film is called How We Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the New Neocons. And I think most people who maybe are already familiar with the neocons and already know the stuff I cover in part one would find part two most interesting because it sort of follows the neoconservative trajectory during the Obama administration. And I lay out a lot of evidence that the neoconservatives in D.C. were very interested in reigniting essentially a new Cold War with Russia. And Robert Kagan's wife, Victoria Nuland, was actually appointed into the U.S. State Department under Obama to oversee policy in the Eastern Bloc. And this all happened like right as sort of the Ukraine situation was unfolding. So it was very convenient timing. And Robert Kagan also was appointed inside the U.S. State Department by Hillary Clinton when she was Secretary of State. And I believe he's actually still there. Part three of the film sort of focuses on the rest of the Kagan family because not just Robert Kagan and his wife Victoria Nuland, but his brother Fred Kagan, Fred Kagan's wife Kim Kagan, and his father Donald Kagan have also played very significant roles in sort of shaping this neoconservative agenda on all different fronts. So Donald Kagan's role for a while has sort of been to rewrite history to make it seem like all these past U.S. presidents have essentially been neoconservative. Kim and Fred Kagan's approach is very analytical, sort of strategic war think tank stuff. So they put out papers pretty much monthly about what we should do in Syria, what we should do with ISIS and things like that. And most recently, they put out a paper called Defeating ISIS, which recommends inserting 30,000 ground troops into Iraq and Syria to essentially start the war over again in Iraq, but then also bring it over to Syria. And then coincidentally, after the neocons got super freaked out about Trump, Marco Rubio is starting to put out his 7-point plan for defeating ISIS. And if you look at this document, it is virtually identical to his 7-point plan. I mean, I would have no doubt that he is being advised by Kim and Fred Kagan at this point.
Right. I mean, characters in your documentary describe the Cold War as a bipolar era. I mean, what exactly does that mean? And did that make it easier to see who was greasing the wheels of war and propaganda?
I definitely think it did. They have a vision that sort of spans over multiple decades. So when people like Robert Kagan and Bill Kristol would talk about the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 90s, all they would talk about was how this created instability in the world. While most people were excited, these people were panicking, and they realized that sort of the military-industrial complex, as we understand it, wouldn't be able to have that excuse over and over again of communism and the Soviet Union as sort of the evil empire. So when they refer to it as the bipolar world, they mean that it was sort of like another superpower existed that could keep the world sort of in this yin and yang balance. It's hard to make sense of, because it almost sounds insane that they would look at the world that way, but they actually do believe that the void created by the collapse of the Soviet Union has thrown the world into chaos. And I think that in part explains their sort of rush and panic and their acceleration of things like the war on terror after 9/11, because it's just a continuation of this instability that they see. And then they need to jump into, that void and act.
Well, what do you think? Are we seeing a new Cold War or a World War III landscape emerge?
I absolutely think we are. And that's the most unfortunate part of all of this, is the war on terror is not, it never ended. So now we have the addition of essentially a new Cold War. And the mentality that came out of the old Cold War was a dumbed down, jingoistic, nationalistic, and fearful mentality. And all those things that I just said also describe the war on terror. So I think it's a really awful development, because just as more Americans seem to be waking up to the power structure, the military-industrial complex, alternative media outlets, and places with good information like MintPress News, while that's happening and those positive developments there, I think that, in the past might have sounded hyperbolic to suggest a World War III scenario, but I think we're going to start seeing more rhetoric, especially from the neocons and the power structure, talking about the Soviet nuclear threat, without calling it the Soviet nuclear threat, but call it Putin's nuclear threat.
Well, thank you so much, Robbie, for joining us today, filmmaker and director of a very heavy agenda. Hopefully we'll continue this conversation soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mnar.
What if I told you there's a group of religious extremists destabilizing the Middle East as we speak? Since their arrival in the region, this terrorist group has systematically oppressed the indigenous population and even imposed strict rules over the practice of religion, both Islam and Christianity, and has attacked their places of worship. During one of this group's most brutal extended assaults in 2014, at least 2,300 people were killed, most of which were children and women. About 10,000 were wounded and at least 300,000 were left homeless in the aftermath. Now they're engaged in a violent struggle to secure the region's energy resources, especially in Syria, and have engaged in a lengthy blockade over a crucial port, preventing anything from crayons to medical supplies from reaching the region's starving population. Water and power are unreliable and unemployment is rampant. And this terrorist group regularly kills journalists, demolishes homes, hospitals, and schools, and even targets key agricultural staples like olive trees to further damage the ability of the local population to survive. Now, you may have thought I was talking about Daesh or ISIS, but actually, through its ongoing occupation of Palestine, Israel has carried out all of these atrocities. That's the genius behind the hashtag JSIL, created in 2014 by watchdog journalist Rania Khalek along with Max Blumenthal and others who expose Israeli apartheid in the illegal occupation of Palestine. Now, JSIL stands for the Jewish State of Israel in the Levant, a play on ISIL, one of the names for Daesh. Now, JSIL illustrates that Israel is not held to the same standards as other actors in the Middle East, but instead is given a pass for human rights abuses and war crimes that we condemn in groups like Daesh. Now, joining me to talk about this is Rania Khalek, an associate editor at the Electronic Intifada, and I began by asking her to explain the origins of JSIL and how it became both a viral phenomenon and also the cause of a tremendous backlash. Check it out.
Well, so the hashtag came about from a conversation I had with Max Blumenthal, a colleague of mine, who had sort of made a little bit of a comparison he was trying to make a comparison between ISIS and Israel. And so from there, we came up with the idea of JSIL, the Jewish state of Israel, the Levant, based on this comparison that he made. and we hashtagged it JSIL, and we drew very strong parallels between the two. I mean, it's not difficult between what the Islamic State is doing and what the Jewish state is doing. The only difference is one is an actual state that's recognized as one, and the other one is like a marauding, death cult, if you will. But either way, I mean, there are a lot of parallels. For example, both JSIL and ISIL behead people. JSIL just happens to do it with drones instead of daggers. You also have a situation where both are these ethnically or these religiously, I guess, exclusive territories that have no recognizable borders. Israel has no internationally recognizable borders, and neither does ISIL. And the fact that both try and recruit foreign fighters. Israel does that through across the United States, recruits people from the U.S. to go be lone soldiers in Israel and occupy Palestine. Both are deeply engaged in acts of ethnic cleansing of people who aren't considered the right kind of either Jew or Muslim, depending on which one you're talking about. So, I mean, these parallels it actually is really striking when you start to really get into it. But it caught on. It caught on Twitter, and it went viral, and a bunch of media outlets covered it, including ones in Israel, and they were not happy about it. And it became a point where the hashtag JSIL was actually being used by people who were just tweeting anything related to Israel-Palestine. And so if you clicked on the hashtag on Twitter, it was almost like a news feed of just like what happened in Israel that day. And so the Israelis were not happy about this. They were not happy about being compared to ISIS. And in particular, so there was actually one incident where Amnesty International had released a report about Israel's conduct in Gaza, and that found, the evidence that Israel had likely committed war crimes. And the communications director for Amnesty UK tweeted out the reports, and he used the hashtag JSIL. And the Israeli embassy in the UK was really angry about it and actually officially responded and blamed it, and said this hashtag is anti-Israel and used by anti-Israel activists. So, I mean, it was good. It was good to make the Israelis a little bit angry, but also, there are serious parallels between the two. And the biggest difference is that there's an international coalition that is devoted to fighting and defeating ISIS. Whereas the Jewish state of Israel and the Levant is supported by every major country in the world and is enabled by the United States. Billions of dollars in military aid and shielding, on the diplomatic front. This is something that you could never imagine being done for ISIS. And so there's also a huge difference in the way that the two are treated.
Right, and with nearly every U.S. presidential hopeful supporting apartheid Israel, including Bernie Sanders, of course, with the exception of the Green Party, should we just expect business as usual from whatever candidate happens to end up in the Oval Office? I mean, what should we expect from these soon-to-be world leaders?
So Obama has been the most pro-Israel, pro-Zionist president in the history of the United States, despite the rap he's gotten among Israelis. Like you said, he's given them more, aid and weapons and military aid and economic aid. He's shielded them from war crimes, from war crimes prosecution, more than any other president. And he's basically he's given up on the issue and just lets Israel get away with whatever it wants. He's about to up the amount that they get yearly to $4 billion from the U.S. That said, I actually do think that whoever does get elected next, if it's an establishment person, if it's Hillary Clinton, she's going to be even better for Israel than Obama was. I mean, Hillary Clinton has already written, or has already declared her intention to make fighting BDS, the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement, a priority of her administration. And a promise she made to one of her biggest campaign contributors, Haim Saban, who's an Israeli-American media mogul whose number one issue is Israel. And then you've got people on the other end, the establishment candidates like Marco Rubio, like Ted Cruz. They are also adamantly pro-Israel to an extreme degree, fanatically so. Especially, I mean, they're funded by people whose number one issues are pro-Israel. The entire Republican Party is. So obviously, whoever the next, if they were to win, they, would be even better than Obama has been to Israel. That said, the really bizarre dynamic of the Republican race is that you have someone like Donald Trump, He's an outright racist, right? He's kind of fascist. And he's not a good person at all, but the fact of the matter is that he also is not somebody who's beholden to the Israel lobby, and he said that he would be neutral on the issue. Whether that's true, who knows? But either way, he's not, expressing this ritualistic, undying level of support for Israel that you hear from other candidates. So it's like this really bizarre dynamic you have going on where the Republican frontrunner, which is Donald Trump, would actually probably, given what he said, be less compromising towards Israel than even Obama has been. And then, all the other candidates, aside from Bernie Sanders, would be Israel's best friends and would make life really much, much worse for Palestinians.
Right, and Israeli occupation and apartheid wouldn't even be possible without U.S. and NATO state assistance, just like apartheid in South Africa wasn't made possible without their support as well. Going beyond hashtags, what can the everyday average American do to support an end to Israeli occupation?
Well, I think as people who don't live inside Israel or Palestine, what the international community, people who are living here, can do is join the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement against Israel. I think that's one of the most important things you can do. Israel needs to be pressured. There has to be a price for its behavior. One of the most important aspects of that is the academic and cultural boycott against Israel, which is incredibly important because that's that's really what got South Africans to turn against apartheid, was not being able to have people, celebrities come play concerts for them. So Israel needs to be denied those things. It can't just be it can't just be like a regular country while it's occupying and ethnically cleansing Palestinians. And so I think it's the most important thing people can do is get involved in BDS. Also, people can write letters to the editor. I think the media really does shield Americans from the reality of the situation. That's why you have so much more sympathy with Israelis and Palestinians, despite a couple weeks ago, Netanyahu called Palestinians wild beasts. And that didn't make any mainstream media headlines, which is kind of shocking. So I think that if people understood the realities better, they would, see what's happening as, in a more realistic way and be more sympathetic to Palestinians. Social media can be really important for getting out information to people as well. So the kinds of reporting that we do, spreading those things as well can really, really can be beneficial for opening people's eyes to the situation in a way they're not seeing in the New York Times.
Well, thank you so much, Rania Khalek, for joining us today, Associate Editor of the Electronica Intifada. Hopefully we'll talk to you again soon. Thank you.
Yep, thanks for having me on.
Well, that's it for today's episode. I'll continue to go behind the headline on my Twitter page at Mnar, MUH. Until then, we'll see you next week.